Does this work? Yes, it does. Welcome to the launch of the Alternative Arrangements Commission report and protocols. My name is Paul Marshall. I'm here because I'm a co-chair of Prosperity UK. Just to give you a small background to how this all came about, Prosperity UK is a non-aligned body combined, which was brought together 2.5 years ago to bring together Leavers and Remainers from all political persuasions to try and work out constructive ways forward for our country post-Brexit. We haven't done very much for about 1.5 years, but we decided that there was an opportunity, even maybe a responsibility to do something about alternative arrangements. Why did we think that? Well, as everybody now knows, there is only one amendment that passed Parliament on Brexit, which was the Brady Amendment on the 29th of January, which passed by 16 votes. Everybody would have normally expected the government to immediately proceed on work to work out what those alternative arrangements could be, but they didn't. So we thought that actually it would be an act of public duty to do work ourselves on alternative arrangements to supersede, to dispense with the need for any checks at the border and to supersede the backstop. We are delighted that Nicky Morgan and Greg Hands were prepared to lead the Commission, and with 46 MPs, again from all political persuasions, Leavers and Remainers, Conservative, Labour, DUP, and that we also had a technical panel of over 20 professionals who are some of the world's leading experts on borders and border technology. We had a first meeting about a month ago. We have since done a whole series of consultations in Belfast, Dublin, Derry, Brussels, Berlin, The Hague and Paris. And we've talked to a lot of people, and this report is the fruit of all of that consultation. It presents a clear path to a negotiated Brexit, which upholds the integrity of the Good Friday Agreement. And we're delighted this morning that Monsieur Barnier has come out with a small press release saying how much he welcomes alternative arrangements. The key point about this morning is, which is different from a month ago, is that we're also launching the two proposed protocols for the border, one of which could go into or alongside the withdrawal agreement, and one would be if there was to be a new negotiated agreement. And the point about these protocols is they really call everybody's bluff on the border issue, because either there are a set of conditions which would mean that we could supersede the backstop and the UK would be able to leave the backstop, or there could be no conditions that could be acceptable to the EU for us to be able to leave the backstop, in which case we would be ill-advised to enter the backstop. So really this is the crux of the issue at stake today, and it's also addressing the source of the mistrust which has arisen between both sides of the negotiations. So we hope that our protocols, obviously, nothing will be taken completely as written into an agreement, but they provide a model of what a set of protocols could look like to go into the withdrawal agreement or alongside it. So I'm going to hand over to Greg and Nicky to lead the session, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Paul, and welcome to 1 Great George Street, who thank you for hosting us here, and thank you particularly to Prosperity UK for making all this possible and providing Paul and Anthony in particular the inspiration behind getting this done. And thanks also to our technical panel, brilliantly led by Shankar Singham. So our final report, thank you to those who came to the launch of the interim report back on the 24th of June. It's now 4 weeks later. We've done exactly what we said, delivered on time. We've been as Paul said, been to 6 cities, Belfast, Dublin, Brussels, Paris, Berlin and The Hague. Before that, we had 4 visits to the island of Ireland, including Belfast, Dublin, Newry, London, Derry. We've actually been to a lot of places. So just a reminder of who we are. We are a group dedicated to finding a solution to Brexit and specifically to the Irish border, using alternative arrangements that would supersede the backstop. As Paul said, we are informed really by 3 things. First of all, the Brady Amendment. Quite often when I travel around different European capitals, people say to me, well, the House of Commons never agrees on anything. You Brits, you can't agree. Well, actually, we did in January. The Brady Amendment to take the withdrawal agreement and replace the backstop with alternative arrangements, passed by, I think, 16 or 17 votes now in the UK House of Commons. People who aren't familiar with it, perhaps, that's actually quite a big majority these days. And that was the resolution of the House of Commons. The second thing that informed us is, of course, the text of the Strasbourg Declaration between the EU and the UK, that both sides are committed to seeking alternative arrangements so that the backstop will not need to be triggered. And the third thing are actually the words of Donald Tusk himself at the European Council meeting when the extension was offered and agreed. He said, please don't waste the 6 months. You know, we have actually delivered in less than half of those 6 months a 277-page report on how alternative arrangements can work. So why have we done this? Because we want to avoid a no-deal Brexit. But it needs compromise. And we're not pretending that this is easy. In fact, it's difficult to get a compromise that can satisfy people in all of London, Brussels, Belfast, and Dublin. This is not an easy job, but we are keen to do what we can to show that it is possible, and that is what the report this morning does. So our interim report has been influential. Anybody like me who follows the Conservative leadership debate closely will have noticed that both candidates, Jeremy Hunt and Boris Johnson, have endorsed the report. I'm quoting Jeremy Hunt, said that he called it an excellent piece of work. Boris Johnson said, an abundant range of solutions, much as in the Hans Morgan paper. So both of them have been very complimentary, and obviously we await next Tuesday to see which of the two becomes our next Prime Minister. But I think our report has certainly been of influence. So we are a group dedicated to solutions. As I say, we are not a no-deal outfit. In fact, we are the exact opposite. We are people trying to find a solution that will satisfy people so that we can get a deal and move on. But equally, we aren't the status quo. There will be changes to how businesses trading across the border will operate. But it won't be a hard border or any new border infrastructure. That is really important to get across, that we are not the status quo, but we think that this is the solution or the main body of a solution to the Brexit conundrum. So just in terms of where we go from here, I'm going to ask Shankar Singham shortly to take us through the final report. And then Shankar's going to hand over to Nicky Morgan, who's going to take us through the 2 new protocols, with also contributions at that point. And then we've got plenty of time, probably almost an hour, for questions and answers. So please, if you can save your questions for that point, and then feel free to ask any of our, me, Nicky, or any of our technical panel your questions. So that is how this morning is going to be run. So now I'm going to pass over to Shankar Singham, who's going to take us through the findings of the final report. Shankar, thank you.
Thank you, and if I can just ask Hans and Frank from the technical panel to come up. Thank you. Good morning. So what I'm going to do, and I noticed on on the screen here, the timings were very, very specific, so I'm going to try to keep to the very specific timings. I'm going to take you through the structure of the report. There are some people here who weren't at the interim report presentation, so I'm going to walk through the whole structure and make comments as I go through it on what we've changed or what we've clarified as a result of the consultations that we have been engaged with. So essentially, we are working to the following constraints. We are obviously, the first constraint is protecting the Belfast Good Friday Agreement and the peace process, and derivative of that, no physical infrastructure or checks on the border. As Greg pointed out earlier on, this is not a status quo situation. The only way to have no checks at all in Northern Ireland is for Northern Ireland to remain in the single market and the customs union. That we don't think is a feasible solution, and we also don't think it won't pass the House of Commons, but it also doesn't satisfy the other constraints that are listed there. Nor is it necessary to ensure that there's no physical infrastructure on the border and no checks and controls on the border, and I think that's the legal interpretation that we have of the December report. It's compatible with any Brexit scenario. If there is, and you'll see this when we talk about the protocols, if there is a withdrawal agreement, such as the withdrawal agreement that is currently on the table, there is a way of dealing with that. If there's some other agreement between the UK and the EU, there is a way that the protocol, a particular protocol, can be used in that respect. And if the parties are not able to agree a deal, one imagines they will be quickly back to the table to try to negotiate something. So in any kind of agreement the UK and EU would have, these alternative arrangements will have to be provided for. The fourth constraint is protecting the integrity of the EU single market and customs union. Our technical panel is a multinational group, so we are trying to solve everybody's problem. We aren't simply saying, this is what the UK government should do. Protecting the integrity of the EU single market and customs union is a crucial issue for them, and any alternative arrangements need to recognise that. And then finally, retaining independent UK trade and regulatory policy. As a result of these many stakeholder engagements, which I think now are up to about 70 or so different engagements with different groups in Northern Ireland, in Ireland, and on the continent, what has been stressed to us with respect to the Good Friday Agreement and the peace process is the importance of context, consent, and community. And our proposals are very much built on that. We also one of the problems, I think, in this whole area is looking at this in terms of a series of problems to be solved on the border. There are problems to be solved on the border, and we try to solve them. But we also have to paint on a broader canvas and recognise the realities of what has been happening in Northern Ireland and in Ireland, and recognise where there are communities of interest that are indivisible communities, indivisible economic units, such as the Derry-Donegal area, such as the Newry-Dundalk corridor. It is very important that we recognise that and we don't divide communities, that we actually build on people's identities as opposed to reducing their sense of identity. Finally, collaboration and trust. There has been a breakdown of trust on the island of Ireland, obviously, and also between Ireland and the UK, between various parties in Northern Ireland and GB. And one of the things that has to happen, and we make a number of recommendations in the report in the operational chapter, which is chapter 13, on how that trust needs to be rebuilt, and there needs to be greater collaboration between the Irish customs authorities, the UK customs authorities, and the French customs authorities, largely because there is obviously 20% of Irish trade into the EU goes through Dover-Calais. So there is a massive interest in Ireland that the Dover-Calais route stands up. Our recommendations, first of all, our recommendations are capable of being put together and up and running within 2 to 3 years. Many of them can be up and running long before that. But we think the whole suite can be up and running within 2 to 3 years. There is a annex in the report that actually sets out in detail exactly which things can go in the short term, which things can go in the medium term, which things can be done in the long term. Everything that we're suggesting in terms of technology is existing technology or customs best practice. These are technical and administrative solutions supported by existing technology. They are not new technology driven. Our solutions are a set of cascading, if you will, options. They provide choice for traders. There isn't a one-size-fits-all process here. There are things that we suggest for larger traders, for the big, the Coca-Colas, the Diageos, the Lakeland Dairies, etc., that are very specific to them, and there are other solutions that we suggest for small traders. We use transit for the general case. I'm going to ask Hans. Hans will answer questions on transit and how transit works. Transit is very much used in the European continent. It is less well known in the UK, and I think one of the things that will need to happen in the UK is increased use of transit. In our report, we actually look at a lot of different borders. We look at the Swedish-Norway border, we look at the EU-Swiss borders, we look at US-Canada border, and we draw lessons from those borders. Which is not to say that those borders are, we're not suggesting they should be the solution for the Irish border, but there are specific lessons that we draw. One of the lessons we draw with respect to the general case of transit is how highly it is used on the Swedish-Norway border, how highly it is used on the EU-Swiss border. In addition, the Swedish-Norway border has provisions for derogations that the EU may give on things like approved roads for SPS checks, which becomes important in the SPS trade. The US-Canada border stands for a proposition in terms of trusted traders, where you can actually have a very advanced, the Canada Self-Assessment Program, which is a very advanced trusted trader program. That is very suitable for the larger companies that are trading across the border that have very, very well developed, well understood supply chains, where they can easily prove up their supply chains, a lot of repeat business going back and forth. We have investigated the possibility of enhanced economic zones as a result of some of the feedback from the consultations. We wanted to make it very clear that what we're talking about here are enhanced economic areas. Those areas can contain within them special customs facilitations, such as special economic zones, such as warehouses and bonded warehouses and all sorts of other things. In terms of the Derry-Donegal and the Newry-Dundalk corridor, we build on the existing exemptions that exist in the WTO, the frontier traffic exemption, national security exemptions, etc., to allow for areas where customs checks are not required. I talked a little bit about the Trusted Trader Program. We're suggesting a multi-tiered Trusted Trader Program. We include in the report an extensive suggestion, and I see two of our technical panel members who are very involved with this, Des and Dinesh there from ACETA, on the sort of program that small business could actually take advantage of. And it's important when we talk about trusted traders, these are customs facilitations. These are a series of facilitations that will make trade easier for those people. So this suggestion, inward storage relief, is in the back of the report. And I understand there are customs agencies actually in other EU member states who are actually already looking at this now. Obviously, when it comes to special areas, regulatory areas and so forth, the SPS area is the one that's attracted a lot of attention. It's attracted a lot of attention because it's so difficult to do this in the general case. The general case for SPS would require a derogation from the EU for approved roads. It would require border inspection posts being pushed back off the border, which is possible under the geographic flexibilities of the border inspection post regulation, and runs along the changes that the EU itself is bringing forward in terms of allowing more checks to be done outside of border inspection posts or border control posts. But all that said, it still is very difficult to deal with this trade, and the economics of the border on the island of Ireland suggests that most of the trade across the border, a significant amount of it, is in SPS goods and agricultural products. And so if you can solve for that, you can take away a lot of the problems on the border. So we have suggested that it would make sense to build on the existing single epidemiological unit that exists on the island of Ireland that allows livestock checks in Larne right now. We suggest that you would include the single epidemiological unit plus products intended for animal consumption. We don't think that's controversial. We think that builds gradually on the current single epidemiological unit. Now, beyond that, we've suggested that a common SPS area is one way of solving the problem. We have looked particularly at the possibility of starting with a common area for both islands, the island of Britain and the island of Ireland, both initially under European SPS regulation, but with the possibility for the UK to diverge. We are taking advantage of the fact that the UK is not going to diverge on SPS on day one. It will take time before we do that, if we do that. And at that point, that's when the decision should be taken. And that is when we suggest a mechanism that involves informing the Northern Ireland Assembly and Northern Ireland Executive through the existing Good Friday Agreement bodies, the North-South Ministerial Council, the British-Irish Council, as part of the cooperation process in the area of SPS, and then a decision taken essentially by Northern Ireland about whether it wanted to follow the UK into its divergence or remain within the Irish SPS area, which therefore would be a common SPS area on the island of Ireland. We have suggested, obviously small traders, we suggest a lot of simplifications and facilitations. In addition to transit, the use of self-assessment, the use of entry into declarants' records, these sorts of simplifications we suggest for small traders. But nevertheless, we understand that this requires something more that they would have to do, or something different that they would have to do. So we suggest everyone under the VAT threshold should have an exemption, that the EU should ask for an exemption, that we should ask the EU for an exemption in that area. But beyond that, the use of the reliance on simplifications and facilitations. But because this is something different, because this is not the status quo, we suggest a transitional adjustment fund. We put a number on it in the report, and we've given, as a result of requests in consultation, we've given some information about the costs of customs forms and what that transitional adjustment fund should look like. We also suggest a capacity building fund paid for by the UK government, not only for, in the case of the Transitional Adjustment Fund, not only for small businesses in Northern Ireland, but in small businesses in Ireland as well. And the Capacity Adjustment Fund, not only for HMRC, but also for Irish Customs, where there is a capacity issue. Those are the timescales. You can read that in the report itself. Happy to answer any questions on it. But again, stressing that there are many things that we can do early in this process, that not everything has to wait 2 to 3 years. There are quick wins that we can get, but a lot of it will depend on the negotiations between the UK and the EU. The time it takes to do things is not constrained by the speed at which we can progress. It's constrained by the negotiation with the EU. This is basically what the report is setting up. We think that it is a way of solving the impasse in the Brexit situation now. It needs to be addressed in any event, and therefore we think this work has to be done at some point. We think it should have been done a long time ago, but we are where we are. So that's basically the report. Now, in terms of changes, what we've done, and you'll see it when you read the report, We have put more information there on costs. We put more information on what the transition fund will look like. We've clarified language around the SPS areas. We've clarified language around the enhanced economic zones. And we've also looked at the issue of smuggling in greater detail, and we have clarified what our recommendations were with respect to smuggling and particularly VAT fraud. So I'd encourage you to read the report in detail. I think we're now going to have Nikki talk about the protocols which have also been added into the report.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much indeed, Shankar. This is an opportunity just for Shankar to have a rest for a couple of minutes before we ask him to speak again. Can I say it's been an absolute pleasure to co-chair this commission. Thank you to Prosperity UK for asking me to do so with Greg. Greg and I worked together a few years ago in the Whip's office, and I think we made a good team then, and I think we made a good team now. So it's been, as I say, it's been a great opportunity to do something positive, actually. And as Shankar said, really, we shouldn't have had to do it. The government should have been doing this. And I see other parliamentary colleagues here were involved in the so-called Malthouse Compromise, which will go down as an A-level history question at some point. What was the Malthouse Compromise and who was involved in it and what happened to it? And obviously alternative arrangements were a part of that. And of course, in March of this year in the Strasbourg Declaration, as Michel Barnier said this morning, the EU and the UK did agree that alternative arrangements would be negotiated. But that, of course, as far as they got. And I think Prosperity UK have done a great service in saying it's not enough just to talk about this. What does it actually mean? And that's what the protocols are about as well. This is about moving forwards and finding a solution. So this morning, in addition, obviously, building on the interim report, we are going to present two protocols. They are at the back of the rather large document you have on your seats that could express alternative arrangements. And the idea of this is not to tell negotiators what they should or should not put on the table, but it is to show that there are ways of capturing the alternative arrangements, what's in the 200 pages, into legal language that can be used in the agreement between the UK and the EU. Now, I always said that Brexit would be good for lawyers, and I say that as a former lawyer, and we're very grateful to the law firm Herbert Smith Freehills who have helped to draft this. But it is important to have these protocols because it's perfectly legitimate for people to say, well, thank you for this 200-page report. What would happen next? How do we capture this in an agreement between the EU 27 and the UK as a way of moving forward? So the first protocol could be applied to the existing withdrawal agreement. It contains obligations that the UK would sign up to in order to ensure that the backstop is not triggered. And of course, remember with the backstop, it's all to solve a problem that nobody wants. And everybody says they don't want the backstop to come into force. Now, in this case, we wouldn't be seeking a time limit to the backstop. The key is to make sure that the backstop is not triggered and it remains the insurance policy that the parties have claimed that it is. It's an important point because both the UK and the EU continue to maintain that the backstop is intended to be that insurance policy only. But certainly the impression that our Commission has had from the island of Ireland is that there are some voices on both sides who think that the backstop is the end state, the final relationship, and that was the issue for many of my colleagues in not enabling the agreement to be passed by the House of Commons. And I do understand that. Now, the second protocol is a standalone document. It contains obligations on both sides. It could be used in any agreement with the EU. It could be a modified form of the withdrawal agreement, or it could be a new agreement, or indeed it could, of course, be used in any future scenario where there isn't an agreement and the UK does leave on October the 31st. But whatever happens, the issue around the Irish border is going to have to be resolved at some point, and this protocol would point the way to do that. So I'm going to hand over to Shankar, who's going to talk, as I say, about some of the details of the protocols, and then we will absolutely be open for questions and answers. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Nikki. And yes, thank you to Herbert Smith Freehills for their help on the protocols. Basically, what we have, and you'll see this, and I want to explain this a little bit because it's not immediately obvious what these protocols are trying to achieve for those who are not lawyers in the audience. We've called them Protocol AB and Protocol C. We've done it for the following reason. They're not entirely equivalent. Protocol AB is a protocol that expresses alternative arrangements, but can be inserted in the withdrawal agreement. It can therefore stand alongside Protocol B, which is what we're calling the current backstop in the agreement. The idea is that there are obligations in Protocol AB that are obligations on the side of the UK government. So, for example, all of the things I talked about in terms of how you'd set up a trusted trader program, how you deal with the common SPS areas we talked about, all of the obligations that could be undertaken solely by the UK government are listed in that protocol. In other words, if the Protocol B, the backstop protocol, is not to be triggered, it is entirely within the ability of the UK government and nobody else to ensure that the backstop would not be triggered. Provided the UK government satisfies the conditions in the Protocol AB, then the backstop would not be triggered. And there is a dispute settlement mechanism under the withdrawal agreement with arbitration and a joint committee and so forth to litigate or to contain any litigation about whether the UK has in fact satisfied its obligations. But the point of this protocol is to do what the EU and the UK have claimed that the backstop represents, as Nikki said, an insurance policy. Well, if it is an insurance policy, well, we're not going to trigger it, and we have the ability not to trigger it. So that's one way of tackling the problem. The other protocol, which we call Protocol C, the letters A and B having been taken, is a different approach. The Protocol C essentially incorporates both the obligations of the UK and the EU. It essentially sets out what both parties need to do in order to ensure that alternative arrangements apply. It is the sort of protocol that could be used in any deal with the EU, not the withdrawal agreement, but any deal. If the parties, and as Greg said early on at the beginning, we want to have a deal with the EU. The purpose of this is to get alternative arrangements up and running so that there can be a deal with the EU. But if, outside of our control, the EU refuses to do any of this, it is not in our hands, it's not in the hands of the UK government alone, to determine whether there's a deal or not. If there is no withdrawal agreement, then we presume the parties will be back to the table fairly quickly to negotiate something. And so there will, at some point, be some sort of deal with the EU. And whenever that point is, there will have to be a protocol that addresses alternative arrangements. So we've written it for that eventuality. So as you read both of these protocols, you'll see obligations that are derived from the recommendations of the report. They are set out in those two legal documents. The only difference between them is that in one case, Protocol C, you have both sides' obligations set out, and in the other case, only the UK's obligations are set out. So I'll stop there on the protocols, and I think we've got plenty of time for questions.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Shankar. We have plenty of time for questions. As I say, we've been joined by two other members of the panel, Hans Beighton and Frank Dunsmuir. Have I pronounced that correctly? Perfect. Very good. So hands up. I don't know if there's a microphone or people are just going to shout. I think people are probably shouting. I saw this gentleman here first. Yes. Perhaps you can just say who you are as well.
Sure. Would you like me to...
Oh, there is a microphone coming. There we are. We've got one. If you could stand as well, that would be great. And just say who you are. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, Sam Lowe, Senior Research Fellow at the Centre for European Reform. Thank you very much for that. My question is about your reinterpretation of the commitment, and I think you're honest about this, so I
Yeah.
don't think I'm speaking out of turn,
Yeah.
when it comes to associated checks, in that you interpret it to be the commitment to be checks literally at the border. You're saying there are going to be lots of checks, but there'll be a way, there'll be a source. And my question is about the desirability of that. Specifically, how do you deal with those people and businesses who do not recognise the legitimacy of any new border? And to be more specific, how many more police do you think you will need? Because there's already issues enforcing the differentials that exist now. How much money will that cost? And how disruptive will this actually be to the peace process? And I just worry that this is all very impressive, but you've kind of missed the point as to why the commitment exists, if actually what you're proposing is going to be just as disruptive as physical infrastructure.
Let me thank you very much, Sam, for that question. And you've gone to the heart of what I think many people obviously have thought about this. I'm going to ask Shankar to talk about the technical bit, but let me talk about the politics a little bit, because the issue around the interpretation first came up when we were discussing this in the Cabinet Office with ministers back in February, when we understood the interpretation that the UK government had put on that December 2017 joint report. And I think, as Greg said at the beginning, the point is that back in 2016 a vote was taken, and the vote was for changes to move away from the status quo. And so what we are, as you say, upfront about here is that there are going to be changes to the status quo. I think the issues around security and how much for the police is very much a matter for the UK government. There's a limit to what a technical panel of 23 as opposed to thousands of civil servants and the police service of Northern Ireland are able to come up with. But I think the other thing we need to, and the debate we had as well in the Cabinet Office, was the true counterfactual to this is what happens in the event of a no deal. Because in the event of a no deal, then the issues that you rightly have identified will have to be addressed by authorities on both sides of the border. So in a way, the true counterfactual is not the current situation. The real counterfactual is what's going to happen in a no deal, and that's why the Irish government, for example, as I understand it, have been asked to think about that and what that's really going to mean. Shankar, is there anything you want to add from a technical point of view?
Well, I would just say a couple of things. I would say, first of all, the legal interpretation of the December report, and without going into the nothing is agreed until everything is agreed and all of that stuff, in our view is related checks and controls, related means at the border. I take your point about what effect this will have, and I'd say a couple of things. One, we have looked at the frontier traffic exemption. A lot of people are very concerned about things like, what do you do if there's a physical check that has to happen in sort of South Armagh? What do you do about it? So we think that a broad interpretation of the frontier traffic exemption that goes not the 15 kilometres of the Trieste exemption, but we suggest 20 miles on either side of the border, would enable you not to do any checks at all in that area. The second thing I'd point out is, what do we mean by checks? And I think this is quite often misunderstood. There is a difference between a formality, an electronic filing, this sort of thing, which is an administrative process, which is what most of it is, versus the very rare physical check dimension to this, where, as you rightly say, that is what could cause issues. So we tried to, through the frontier traffic exemption, through other WTO national security exemptions, try to limit those. But that's precisely why we said, for small businesses outside of the frontier traffic exemption area, outside of any enhanced economic zone, they're going to have to do something in addition to their VAT registrations. In addition, if they're trading in SPS goods, they're already filing on traces. So they're already doing a lot of things. We would ask them to do one additional thing. And I think the UK government, since the UK has made the choice to leave the European Union, and many businesses in Northern Ireland and in Ireland didn't want that to happen, the UK government should pay a transitional adjustment fund so people can be geared up to handle those administrative processes.
Thank you. And Tom, there's a microphone. Yeah, he's racing towards you.
Thanks, Tom Newton-Dunn from The Sun. 4 questions.
Blimey.
Very quickly.
Gosh.
Are they quick yes/no questions, or are they going to be long questions?
No, it's a multiple choice.
Right.
You know the answers. I'll talk about very quickly though. All technical. On the small trader exemptions, how is the single market protected on effectively a small trader free-for-all across the border? Have you costed the extra bureaucracy to businesses for all cross-border trade? If all this isn't ready for 3 years, up to 3 years, you say, what happens in the meantime? Presumably a standstill transition, and can you guarantee it'll be ready in 3 years' time, in time for the 2022 general election, if it gets that far, of course? And in terms of the SPS, I presume that's an island-to-island-wide zone. Are the DUP signed up to that? Because that is quite a clear movement away from the current status quo.
Shankar, are you okay to?
Yeah, and I'll
Might go into
also
politics,
ask Hans to come in on the
Yes,
costs
do.
of custom. Basically, if I can just see
Small
the...
trader exemption, how is a single market protected?
Yeah, so the UK government asked for a small trader, or asked for a trader exemption of up to, I think, about $1 million or something of that nature. That's clearly a threat to the single market and the customs union. We don't think that asking for a small trader exemption up to the £85,000 VAT threshold is a threat to the single market or the customs union. And I think, that as the EU itself has said, and we include it in chapter 1 of the report, creative and imaginative solutions will be needed to solve the issues of the Irish border. And if you can't get your head around the fact that someone trading less than £85,000 in revenue a year is a threat to the single market and the customs union, that's not very imaginative or creative. So we would suggest that we certainly ask for that exemption.
The cost of cross-border
Cost of the
trade.
extra bureaucracy.
Cost of extra bureaucracy, I will ask Hans to deal with some of the costs. We do address costs a little bit in the report. I should point out, though, that we are, our mandate and our sort of terms of reference were to look for facilitations, not to provide in a 6-week period an entire costing of every facilitation that we've come up with. However, that said, we have looked at some of the costs and we have put a number on the transitional fund. A lot of the costs can be reduced. There are definite forms, for example, that do entail government costs where the government could not charge, essentially. There are other forms that don't entail government cost where you do have, to hire a logistics service provider or provide the services yourself. We've looked at the costs that other traders have in customs. So, for example, I've included an example in the report of Tate & Lyle, the cost for Tate & Lyle of all of their customs operations globally, and they trade a product that is difficult to trade. It's about 0.04% of their operating budget. So that gives you a sense of the scale of these costs in the context of a larger company.
The 3 years.
So our objective is to set out what these facilitations are and then to give you some sense of how long we think they will take. And the annex at the back of the report that has the table that was just up there on what can be done in the 6 to 9 month period, 12 to 15 month period, 15 to 18 month period, 18 to 24 month period, is our sort of best estimate of what this will take. But I want to make a point here about the length of time that things will take is not dependent on developing technology. I think people often say, well, it's going to take 10 years to invent this technology that doesn't exist. That is not the case. The length of time will depend. So, for example, mutual recognition of a current existing AEO program, which the EU would have to do in order for it to work across the border. That depends on how long it takes for the EU to negotiate that with us. But a lot of this it requires goodwill on both sides, and we're pretty clear about that. What would happen in the meantime? Well, we're doing this in order that there can be a deal. A deal will include some sort of standstill or transition period in which these things will be put together.
And the DUP and the One Ireland
And
SPS.
so the SPS areas. Obviously, a common SPS area on the island of Ireland requires differences between GB and Northern Ireland that the DUP and others have said is not acceptable. Our approach here is to say, well, you don't need to solve a politically difficult issue when it's not ripe, it's not ready to be solved. The UK is not diverging right now. It will not be diverging on SPS rules from the European system for some time, if at all. So why not have a common all-island, Island of Britain, Island of Ireland SPS area that then has a trigger point where if the UK does diverge, then this decision can be made. And this is not a decision that suddenly gets made. It's going to be informed by the North-South Ministerial Council, by the British-Irish Council, by many of the Good Friday Agreement bodies that haven't been particularly active recently. But they will have to engage in it because SPS trade, animal welfare, and food standards is right at the top of the list in terms of areas of cooperation under the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. It is the one area where you can genuinely say there is, in fact, an all-island economy. There are many, many other areas of the economy where the East-West trade is far, far more important in terms and more significant economically. There is a genuine case here with SPS that it is an all-island economy trade. But our recommendation is that decision is made at the appropriate time. And I think what will also happen is by having a two islands SPS area, what is going to happen is checks will be done in the ports and harbours of the Irish Sea and in ports and harbours generally, which are natural breakpoints, which is where the technology as it develops over time will be more effective and more easily deployed. And people will begin to see, I think, as they have seen with the single epidemiological unit and the livestock checks in Larne, that this is not in fact a massively disruptive, invasive thing. In fact, every time there is an outbreak of a disease or foot and mouth or blue tongue or whatever it happens to be in any member state, there are checks between that member state and other member states. So this happens now. So in Michel Barnier's words, perhaps that this might de-dramatise some of the effective checking in the ports and harbours of the sea and in airports and so forth, where customs checks actually belong. And it is a decision then consistent with the principle of consent, and it's a decision ultimately for the Northern Ireland Assembly and Executive as to what they want to do.
It's also worth, if I might just add, having been in the Department of International Trade for 2 years with particularly these kind of questions, and with the two Secretaries of State, Liam Fox and Michael Gove, the relevant Secretary of State, both of whom were committed to no change or no watering down of animal welfare standards or food safety standards. I tend to take the view that if Liam Fox and Michael Gove are not going to diverge, then this is something which is personally, I think, is unlikely to happen in the near term. Of course, it could happen, and that is why we have a procedure in place if it did happen. But today is all about trying to solve problems that are with us today and trying to find a Brexit solution. That is what the report is all about. And trying to solve theoretical problems in the future, which could happen, but I personally think are unlikely. As I say, if Michael Gove and Liam Fox are unlikely to diverge, then you'd have to ask the question, who would diverge? Then I don't think we should be expending an enormous amount of energy trying to solve theoretical problems, given the fact we're about 3 months away from Brexit date at the moment.
Frank, did you want to, Hans, do you want to add anything about costs?
Yes, well, we analysed the figures that HMRC brought forward that the brokerage activities would cost 13 billion after Brexit. And if you make some very simple calculations, you see that's way, way overestimated. Costs of brokerage are very different. Of course, if you have highly automated systems with AO certified companies, you can bring it down to £1 for a declaration because it's all automatic. It's just a process of data. But if you have an individual case, of course, that costs more. Now, the brokerage industry available in the UK at the moment is rather modest. You find it in Heathrow, you find it in Felixstowe, a little bit in Dover, but it will have to get a boost because all transactions with countries in the EU will have to go through a brokerage procedure. And they can be simple and they can be very difficult. So you'll have to get a boost in places like Holyhead, Dublin, Northern Ireland, and this brokerage industry will be partly in administrations of women exporting companies. So it'll be invisible there, it's just an administrative process. There'll be logistic service providers providing transit procedures, providing guarantees. So that doesn't have to be provided by women exporters themselves. It's a service you can buy. It'll be a commodity as it is on the continent. And there will be consultants, there'll be specialized customs brokers. So a whole new industry of brokerage industry will have to be developed in the UK and also on the island of Ireland, on both sides. And that'll involve costs. There'll be HMRC costs, DEFRA costs, etc. And they'll be cast on the side of Indian exporting companies. And we said with the transition fund that there should be large support to mitigate these costs for all involved. And then, as customs is invisible now, it will be invisible shortly after Brexit, because it's just, you don't notice it now and you won't notice it then, because it's just an administrative procedure taking place at specialized companies and even export departments of Indian exporters.
Thank you. So a long question gets a long couple of answers. Rob, yeah, wait for the microphone, it's just coming to you. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Rob Merrick from The Independent. Sorry, can I press you on the costs? Mr. Singh, when you appeared before the Brexit Committee a couple of weeks ago, eyebrows were raised there that you were unable to put a cost on these proposals. I think pretty sure I heard you promising to seek to do so today. I still haven't heard what the cost is going to be. So can you say what will be the cost to companies of the customs declarations that you referred to, and what will be your estimate of the cost to the taxpayer or the fund that will have to go in to enable all this stuff to happen? So clarity on the cost, please. And secondly, unless I'm missing something, you said Boris Johnson welcomed your interim report, which of course he did. Mr. Johnson says the agreement is dead, kaput, has ceased to be, the backstop has to be stripped out, but you appear to be saying that the withdrawal agreement should go ahead, but with an additional protocol to ensure the backstop never has to be introduced. So therefore, if you're saying insert a protocol into the existing withdrawal agreement, the future Prime Minister is saying the withdrawal agreement is dead, isn't your report dead on arrival?
Rob, thank you very much for those non-controversial questions. Shankar, we'll cover the fund in a moment. I mean, I would just say two things in response to that. Firstly, I don't think it's our job to cost. That is what thousands of civil servants are there for. And frankly, they should have been doing it over the last few months. I think it's unreasonable, actually, to expect a technical panel of 23, some parliamentary commissioners and people who are not in central government to be able to come up with a costs estimate. But I think the point is, as you just heard, there is going to be a cost, and we think that it would be absolutely right that the UK has voted to leave, so the UK government should be paying for that and making a significant contribution to supporting businesses through all of that. Which is exactly why I suspect that the OBR this morning, in their fiscal risks report, have talked about, if there were to be a no deal, the costs obviously of that. So, you know, if this were to work and there were to be a deal, then the cost would not probably be as high as the OBR has forecast in terms of the impact on debt and borrowing of this country, but there would be significant costs. And the other thing in terms of the withdrawal agreement, well, both candidates have said that they think that the current withdrawal agreement is dead. But of course, you know, we'll have to see what happens when whoever takes over next week and everything. We've been very clear that the protocol is not to be inserted, but we talk about it superseding. There are different ways of both sides coming to an agreement that actually some additional words can clarify. But we're very clear, Greg and I, in our forward to all of this, that actually pragmatism and goodwill is going to be required on all sides. Otherwise, we do end up potentially in a no-deal situation by default. And I think that's what the real danger of the next couple of months is that everybody says they don't want there to be a no-deal, and somehow we end up at that situation in October, which also many of my parliamentary colleagues are concerned about, because nobody actually could find a ladder which gave the opportunity to say, actually, we haven't changed the withdrawal agreement, but we have clarified it by adding these words or by referring to these words separately. As a former lawyer, there are lots of creative ways to refer to additional words without actually adding them to an agreement. Shankar, is there any more you want to say on the fund cost?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of costs, as Nikki said, you know, we're a private group, a small private group with a limited budget, who has produced this report in about 6 weeks. A report which, as Nikki said, we think the government should have been working on for the last 2.5 years. We don't have 18,000 civil servants to do this. I did say at the hearing I would try to produce more information on costs, but the cost question is difficult because, first of all, there are many of the proposals that we have that are cost neutral, and there are many proposals that we have that actually save cost. So, for example, the AEO program, when Brazil introduced an AEO program, Brazil is not the easiest country to do business in. Nevertheless, did an AEO program in 3 years, saved $1.5 billion as a result of the AEO program. it is expected that by 2030 they will save $17 billion. Okay, so it isn't just a question of
It's going to be billions of pounds. Can you confirm that? Will it be billions?
No, it's not going to be billions.
No.
And it depends
No.
what it's going to be. So it depends what the facilitations are. Our job here is to lay out in a 6-week period the facilitation.
Rob, I know what headline you're looking for, but because we're not going to
No,
estimate.
no.
Because actually that is the job of the government, to take this report and to cost it themselves. Because exactly as Sam has talked about, it's not just about cost to business, it's about potentially security and other things and money that gets saved. So it is not our job to put on costs. It is our job to come up with proposals for facilitations and to prove that new technology is not needed to make this solution work. Right, gentleman there with the beard, yes.
Dennis Staunton from the Irish Times. I'd like to follow up on Rob's other question because it's essential. You mentioned the Brady Amendment and the Strasbourg Agreement, and the Brady Amendment speaks about replacing the backstop with alternative arrangements. The Strasbourg Agreement reflects what the Europeans think, which is alternative arrangements can ensure that the backstop would never be triggered, and so it wouldn't come into effect. But the fact is that both of the candidates for the leadership have said the backstop has to be removed. And so one arm of what you're suggesting seems to be, as Rob said, dead on arrival. And so the conclusion of that, is it not, is that the question that the Europeans and the Irish must ask themselves is, are these proposals something that would do the job of the backstop and would resolve the issue of the border right away without having that insurance policy of the backstop? So you're really not talking about this as something that would ensure it doesn't come into effect, but you're actually talking about it as being an alternative right away to the backstop.
Well, it could certainly be interpreted in that way, in the sense of if the new Prime Minister next week decided that they wanted to put this on the table with one of the protocol AAB, that's what it's been drafted for. Of course, it's very difficult to know at this stage. We don't know who the lucky candidate is going to be, and their approach to EU matters on days 1, 2, and 10. So that's the point, is having options. And of course, the whole point is these are negotiations and these are discussions. And that's what we need to give space for, and that's what our report is about. I don't know whether Greg wants anything political, and then Shanker maybe?
Well, I would just say I think this whole process is very, very difficult. I liken it to like landing an A380 on some kind of regional airstrip. And if you're asking us as a panel, our job is to produce a technical report to show that it is possible. So if your question is seeking us to sort of narrow the airstrip even further, we're trying to make that airstrip as wide as possible, so to give maximum room for the negotiations, for the negotiators. We are not negotiators. We are here to produce a report. And the last thing we would want to do would be to close down options. If the next Prime Minister himself wants to choose different options, exclude different options, that is a matter for him, not a matter for us. We view our mission as creating the widest possible field.
They've already shut down.
Well, let's just see.
Well, let's see. We'll certainly know soon enough. Next Tuesday and Wednesday.
Let me just add one thing to that and to pick up Rob's final point as well. There are two sides here. There is the UK and the EU. And this is why we have written two protocols. We've written a protocol that, from an EU perspective, if they are unwilling even to contemplate the protocol AB approach, well, I think that tells you something. On the other hand, we have specifically written Protocol C so that it encapsulates alternative arrangements for any scenario, any deal. At some point, there will have to be a deal. Even the people who talk about managed no deal require the EU to agree to something. So at some point, they will have to agree to something, and when they want to agree to something, they will want reassurance about what happens on the Irish border. And that's why we've written a protocol that's specifically designed to do that. So part of what we're trying to do here is to start a conversation which had not been occurring. This conversation had not been occurring in the government. It had not been occurring in the Irish government. It has not been occurring in the European Commission either. And we saw that as a very, very big problem, and we wanted to fire up that conversation, which we think we have done. And then it will be up to them. It will be up to the EU and the UK negotiators to see if they can come to a deal. And if they are going to come to a deal, there will have to be ladders down on all sides.
Jonathan.
Jonathan, this is Vee from Brexit Central. You've said that Protocol C is to be used in any Brexit scenario, but clearly one Brexit scenario is that we leave on the 31st of October without a withdrawal agreement, and yet we're told it takes 2 to 3 years for these arrangements put in place. If a new Prime Minister next Wednesday put all the machinery of government behind making this happen, how much of it could be done by the 31st of October, or do you believe that's impossible and it's the case that the government should have been working at full pelt on this for the last 3 years? And secondly, to what degree do you think it would be so much easier if the Northern Ireland Assembly were sitting and there was devolved government up and running in Northern Ireland?
Shanker, do you want to take the approach? I mean, I think the point, Jonathan, is that the protocol obviously could be negotiated, but in terms of the actual solutions, as you see in the chart about the different timescales for them.
Yeah, and I'll also ask Frank to come in on some of the technological sort of timescales.
Greg, you might take the Assembly point.
But I mean, I think basically what I would say is regardless of what happens, even if we leave, and there is, as Nikki said, an accidental no deal, in other words, no one wants to have no deal, but we just can't agree anything and we just exit. Legal default option is to exit without a withdrawal agreement. There will still be a need for this Irish border to be solved. It is very clear in a no deal, in a true no deal, in other words, no agreement of any kind, the situation for the Irish border will be, and again it goes to the constraint about protecting the EU's desire to protect the single market and the customs union. They cannot have an open channel in Ireland. That means that there will either be a border on the island of Ireland, not erected by us, but erected by the Irish government, or there will be a border between Ireland and the EU26. There's no other way of doing it. That is the conversation that needs to be faced, I think, pretty firmly by in particular the Irish government, and I think they are facing it now. I think member states and the Commission have been asking them, what is your no deal plan? How are you going to protect the single market and the customs union? And as that becomes clear, that the choice is alternative arrangements or one of those two scenarios, which is that's catastrophic for the Irish economy and for the Irish government, it will become more relevant and more important for them to focus on the importance of agreeing alternative arrangements. And you already saw, even now, even at this early stage, the Irish government, Varadkar, talking about, well, maybe there could be checks away from the border, mirroring some of the things that we've suggested. So I think it's important in this process. It is an incredibly difficult process, as Greg said. It's important not to leap to the end state, and to understand that we are in a process, we are in a negotiation, and what is your next move? Well, clearly the next move has got to be to have a serious conversation about these alternative arrangements, and that's what we're trying to get moving.
I think, Jonathan, in terms of your question about, I'm not an expert on Northern Irish politics, but what was striking is the interactions we've had with 4 of the parties. We've met with the DUP, we've met with the UUP, the Alliance and the SDLP. All of whom we had very, very good, constructive meetings with. They're genuinely very keen to find out what our proposals were. To be honest, 2 or 3 of those parties prefer the status quo. They prefer the backstop, and that was exactly what we expected. Sinn Féin refused to meet with us, which is regrettable. But I think that sort of is symptomatic of the problem with the suspension of the Assembly at the moment, is where is the democratic buy-in in Northern Ireland for whatever is being proposed is I think a real issue. And the Belfast Agreement, I've got it with me here, it's worth remembering, of course, it's not just about the border, but it does state it would be wrong to make any change in the status of Northern Ireland save with the consent of a majority of its people. So I think having the Assembly up and running would be very, very helpful in finding a Brexit solution and avoiding a hard border. But that's, again, something which is certainly outside the control of this panel and this report. But I think I'm supposing everybody in this room would be united in thinking it would be helpful to have the Northern Ireland Assembly back up and running and the executive back up and running.
Frank, was there anything you want to add on the timing points?
Yeah, I think the way we've approached the timing is looking at the transition period. So can we achieve a point after the transition period where we can meet the obligations of the alternative arrangement, the agreement with the EU? So have we control over the borders in the way that satisfies both parties? Now, there's a number of items in the plan there that relate to policy decisions like a trusted trader scheme, etc., and various derogations. And we've also focused on the sort of technologies that are needed to support those changes as well. An important point around this one is we're not talking 10 years. We're not inventing technologies. We're using stuff that's there today. So as part of our work, we did a lot of research with organisations that are doing some really fantastic work around traceability, for example. So there are improvements that are being driven by the consumer market, the retail sector, by farmers themselves. And it's about using those technologies, those existing ones, and pulling those into the customs arrangements as well. So that's the approach we've taken here. It's a pragmatic approach and not one to invent sophisticated unicorn technologies, as it were. If that makes sense.
Lady there with the glasses, just put my just coming. Yep.
I'm Stephanie, I'm the UK correspondent for German Die Welt. 2 questions, if I may. First of all, you said that Monsieur Barnier has already welcomed your report. But whenever you talk to Task Force 50 or people in Brussels, they're quite adamant that neither the Brady Amendment nor what they've seen so far from your alternative arrangement proposals is really you can put into place. So do you think that at the end of the day, in the Commission, Task Force 50 is far more driven by ideology than pragmatism? And a question to Greg, in your context with the government in Berlin, so not so much the CDU, but the government really, has anyone said to you they think that your alternative arrangements can really supersede the backstop?
So I think in terms of the EU point, I mean, that is a matter for the EU and for the Commission, obviously, to answer. We understand that they have had a briefing on the report, certainly on the interim report, and there was some indication on social media that they had some tests that they thought that the report would need to meet. But clearly it's difficult at the moment. We're after the elections, an interim period with the Commission. The new Parliament is obviously finding their feet, and we shall have to see. But I go back to what I said about pragmatism and goodwill on all sides, and if people want to avoid a no deal, then we need to find a deal and an agreement and a way through, and that's a task, obviously. We shall watch in the UK how the new Prime Minister approaches that and their conversations with obviously fellow EU leaders in the EU Commission, which I suspect means a busier August for people than people would have ideally wanted. Greg, how about the German government?
So did you ask about the UK government or the
German government?
The German government. When we were in Berlin, we met with a series of interested backbenchers, not representatives of the government, which is pretty much what we expected because we are not a governmental body. And it was an interim report. But we met with influential CDU-CSU members. We met with Jürgen Hart, who is as you know, the CDU Foreign Affairs spokesperson. We met with Detlef Seif, who is the CDU-CSU Brexit rapporteur. We met with Alexander Dobrindt, who is the CSU parliamentary leader. So we met with a number of people who aren't technically in the government, but are influential within government circles. And their response to our report, I would say, was warm. Complimentary about the content. One person, they're private meetings, I better not say which specific person out of that list, but one person congratulated us for seemingly doing the work that others might have done. And that I thought was a helpful comment. So I think in general people gave a warm reception, but I think, to be frank, I think everybody's waiting to see what the UK government will propose starting from next week before coming out with a comprehensive response to our report. And I think that is not an unreasonable position to take if I were another EU member state.
Well, I think just as one thing, Nikki talked about counterfactuals earlier on.
Yeah.
This is the critical point. We are at a different time now than we were a year ago, 2 years ago. The issue is, what is the counterfactual? Our objective here was to put a set of facilitations, and there are only so many things you can do. I mean, this is more of a process of discovery than a sort of invention of things, you know. So a set of pragmatic proposals that could, in our view, work. Put them on the table, let the negotiators talk about them. But yes, if they are not willing to be pragmatic, if they're not willing to find a way out of this situation, then we will have an accidental no deal. And what that means for Ireland, an EU member state, is that there will either be a border in Ireland or there will be a border between Ireland and the EU26. There's no other way.
Anthony, right at the back.
Thanks very much, Nikki, and thank you to the panel. In terms of the menu available to the future Prime Minister, there seems to be any combination of a extended or extendable implementation period, a nationwide backstop, or a Northern Ireland specific backstop. Is not the hope that the EU will agree to the parameters that mean that the border can be solved via these arrangements, such that some combination of those three things can lead to a path out from the UK without the integrity of the withdrawal agreement being removed? And thus, aren't there grounds to be optimistic that actually their flexibility around this point will mean that they'll fudge it in such a way as to keep both the Irish happy and the British parliamentarians happy, as ultimately this is not a backstop issue, it is a front stop that should have been resolved several years ago, and we're simply doing it a little later than intended?
Yes.
No, I think that's right. I think if you look at our proposals, there are elements of all the things you talk about that are in our proposals. Because, as I say, there's only so many ways you can solve this problem and satisfy the constraints that we've set out. So, I mean, I think that reasonable, pragmatic people who want to avoid the situation I described before need to really work on this and really try to develop from this some flexibility in their negotiations.
Thank you. Yes, hand here, yes. Microphone is just coming. Who else would like to ask questions, just so I've got a sense of how many more hands there are? 1, 2, okay, lovely, thank you.
David
David.
Hennick, European Centre for International Political Economy. 2 points, questions. Number one, and I'm here on behalf of the sort of, with my former civil service hat on, I think there's a little bit too much kind of dumping going on saying the civil service haven't done this. Is it not the case the civil service have looked at many of these things but found them to be incredibly complex and they couldn't fit the criteria set by politically? And I give one example, the VAT that you say, let's be part of the EU's VAT scheme, that brings in the court of the EU, which is was a red line. So actually there is this fundamentally incredibly complex matter, which is what you've actually been saying, and therefore the civil service have been doing their work. And also I'd be interested to know how you're going to reconcile that issue on VAT. Second point, in terms of Ireland, and you keep talking about the counterfactual being no deal, if we recall right at the start of this process, the EU did not want the entire deal to be reliant on what they thought was the danger of the UK, frankly, I'll use the word blackmailing the Irish and saying, you have to accept what we offer, otherwise there will be a border. Is there not a danger that in fact we are pretty much saying this, well, here's our best offer, take it or it will be your fault? That is not a very cooperative message, and we actually need to go back to their actual concerns, which is that there's a lot more than this will be needed.
David, thank you very much indeed for the questions. I'll ask Shankar to talk about the VAT point, because that is something we have addressed. We tried it in the final report. I think on the civil service point, when we talk about UK government, we're talking about ministers. You're absolutely right. The civil service have to operate within the political direction set by ministers and within the red lines that are set by ministers in terms of right from early on in the process. Now, I think the civil service will have done some of this work. As I say, having sat there for many hours in the Cabinet Office back in February, what was interesting was that we did ask for a number of details. We didn't get them. Now, we don't know whether that's because the work hadn't been done or because the civil servants were unable to share them with us and not given political permission to do so. But I know from my time in government, and I think Greg would say the same, we have enormously talented civil servants in this country.
I had
would
one
not want
particularly,
people...
sorry, Nick, I had one particularly enormously talented civil servant who was the questioner
Right,
at DIT, David Hennig.
Formerly of that parish. So this is not anything to do with the quality or hard work or ethics, work ethic of the civil service. This is an issue where actually when political instructions could have been given, whether 2.5 years ago or earlier on this year, that direction was not given. And of course, civil servants can't go off on frolics of their own. They've got to wait for that direction to come from the top. And in terms of the cooperative message, I mean, at the end of the day, I think that there are some realities. One of the things I think that has most frustrated constituents, people who are not involved in this process, has been all when the realities have not been confronted of what has been happening. There is just a reality around the border, and I think it is clear that the UK government, at least one of the leadership contenders, has said, we will not put a border in. But there's no doubt, listen to Michel Barnier this morning on the radio, the importance of the integrity of the single market is very, very important to the EU. And so the reality has to be confronted, and that's the discussion we think is probably going on between the Commission and the Irish government, which is how would we protect the single market in the event of there being the UK leaving without there being an agreement. You're absolutely right to say cooperative message. You can't have pragmatism and goodwill if both sides aren't going to show it, but you've also got to have, as I think has happened, some tricky discussions on both sides as well. Shanker, do you want to say anything about the VAT bits we did in the final report?
Yeah, and I just echo what you said about, I mean, I think our concern has been about political conversations haven't been occurring, not about the work of the civil service. You know, these are conversations that are now starting. You know, so for example, on the island of Ireland, and particularly with the Irish government, they are now starting slowly to discuss alternative arrangements. Well, we've known that we're going to be in this situation for 2.5 years. We think that discussion should have started a lot sooner, politically, and political instruction should have been given to that effect. On the VAT stuff, our recommendations for VAT are, first of all, we have recommended that the UK remain in the VES system, which is a facilitation system. We've also recommended that both Ireland and the UK adopt postponed accounting for VAT, which is something that member states can do. It's a member state choice. Some member states do, the Dutch do, the UK doesn't at the moment, but we recommend that they should. In terms of VAT fraud, which is a question that came up previously, or as a part of our consultation process, and I'll ask Hans to sort of come in as well on this. There is no mechanism right now. As long as the VAT rates are aligned and you're in the VES system, we don't think the issue is a particularly difficult issue. But there is no mechanism right now for reclaiming, for consumer products, for reclaiming VAT at the border, because you can't have physical infrastructure at the border and you can't have people at the border doing that. So one of the suggestions that we have as a policy choice is simply for consumer products to say, well, right now nobody is getting anything back, obviously because we're all within the same system, that for trade and consumer products on either of the two islands there wouldn't be any VAT reclaimable. The bigger issue for VAT fraud for the EU is the 150 billion euros worth of carousel fraud, which occurs between member states. And when we're not a member state, that won't be an issue, I think, for us. But do you want to say something, Hans, about that?
No, I agree with that.
Okay, lovely. Thank you. There's a hand right at the back. Yes, there.
Thank you. Eric Albert, I'm from Le Monde, the French newspaper. You've asked the EU to be pragmatic, the Irish government to be pragmatic. How are your negotiations going on with the DUP? Given the parliamentary arithmetic, they are key. You are talking of diverging here. How worried are you that they are going to block those proposals? And just a simple, I'm no trade specialist, but explain to me, Brexit happens. We're in 2025. You've signed a FTA with the US. Chlorinated chicken, for instance, comes in Northern Ireland. How does this chlorinated chicken in Northern Ireland is stopped into going into the Republic of Ireland? Who checks where? How does it work?
Okay, well, I'll come, perhaps the actual sort of way the checks work and everything else. In terms of the DUP, you'll notice on the list of parliamentary commissioners that there are some members of the DUP who were part of the parliamentary commissioners for this report. That doesn't mean that everyone has said, that's it, I'm totally supportive. Obviously, there have to be conversations within the DUP when there are parliamentary votes, but I think there are also conversations going on between leadership contenders and, of course, the DUP, and it's very much a matter of them. I don't think we can speak for them, but you're very welcome, obviously, to contact DUP MPs. They've been aware and involved in much of this process as to where they are. How do the checks work? How do things actually get followed through the system?
Infamous chlorinated chicken. So before I talk about chlorinated chicken, just to give you a sense that this process hasn't come out of nothing. It started with a conversation that actually Hans and I were both involved in with Michel Barnier about alternative arrangements back in October of last year. It has gone through the Malthouse compromise discussions with the Cabinet Office. It is built on all of that. So it is not something that sort of emerged out of nothing, nor is it something with which the European Commission is unfamiliar. I think they've been quite familiar with the sorts of proposals that we have from the beginning. In terms of the DUP, obviously, as people have said, they haven't taken a position. No one has taken a position on this. But in the context of those discussions that started with Barnier in October and went through various iterations of this work, I think the DUP has been very sympathetic to this work. And if they weren't sympathetic, they wouldn't have agreed to be commissioners on the commission. So we'll continue to discuss these things with them. And I don't think anything that we've suggested in this report is going to be particularly problematic for them because our approach on the SPS question is to have a two islands SPS area with a decision to be made at a later date. In terms of checks, part of the ability to check for non-conforming products, shall we say, that are going into member states relies on SPS checks, it relies on market surveillance, it relies on all of these different techniques that are used. Those techniques will be used in the case of trade between the UK and the Republic of Ireland. I don't know if you want to say anything about SPS.
Well, yes, you'll obviously, if you trade on the Northern Irish border, you want to smuggle there. That's on the fringe of the European Union, so it's not a real logical smuggle route. But if you look at the chlorinated chicken, that would have to go through an export declaration from the UK, where the goods are obviously imported from the United States, and that would go through an import declaration procedure in Ireland. And they would say, hey, there's some chicken here, let's have a look at it. It's a risky product. It's a regular procedure where a risk assessment is made, and if the risk is high enough, they'll have a check on the paper or a physical check. That's the way it works. I think so they should be able to identify that and prevent it. But next to that, you have to look at the market. You cannot check everything, and there can be something going through that you didn't notice. And so then you use market intelligence to follow up on that.
Yeah, I think the important point about smuggling and non-conforming products is that smuggling is not best dealt with by customs interventions. It is dealt with through intelligence and through market surveillance and in-market activities. And so, chicken from Thailand right now, European inspectors go to the facilities. That will happen if people are concerned about smuggling of chlorinated chicken or anything else. It is entirely appropriate to go to the facilities in the UK or in mainland GB to ensure that the products that are intended for the EU are satisfying European standards. That's a normal process that occurs all over the world every day.
Can I add to that as well?
Please.
So in a similar way, this already exists today. So if you look at products like Aberdeen Angus beef, which is more expensive and more prized, it's not overwhelmingly surprising that some of that is actually fraudulent, and it's not Aberdeen Angus beef that you're buying. So that problem does exist in the marketplace to some degree today, and there are organisations that are, and by consumer demand and by retail demand, to guarantee that product to an ever more satisfactory level. And there are organisations like NSF are here today with us, Rob Chester over there, working on some fantastic products that are really looking at the traceability from the farm to the consumer, and just delivering greater integrity. And it's those sort of things that we'll be bringing into these solutions going forward. So it's something that exists today, and it's something that we can improve on with existing technology as well.
And I'd also mention Chapter 13 of the report contains an extensive operationalising set of recommendations in terms of how you deal with smuggling, with fraud, with all of these things. Again, it's not customs interventions to solve this. It's national targeting centres, it's data management, it's collection of information.
I thought two final questions. Was there a hand over on this side of the room? Yes, there's one there and a lady here as well. I think we'll take them both together. There might be different questions, but and then I think we'll draw things to a close.
Thank you, Alex Stojanovic from the Institute for Government. I really just have a question about whether, in trying to kind of satisfy each side, you're kind of creating more problems than you solve in a number of areas, and that might be justified if it avoids no deal. But nevertheless, I still think it's worth pointing out a few areas. So one area I think is with the Northern Ireland Executive having a choice of which side to align to. I find it difficult to see how any Northern Ireland executive would survive making that choice. And that what you're doing is, yes, you're kind of delaying that choice to need to be made, but in reality, wouldn't it be better if you actually try to build support for one version or another? It's clearly the case that Northern Ireland and Ireland alignment on SBS would solve so many of the problems. It would definitely give confidence for the chlorinated chicken problem, and it doesn't commit you to saying that the rest of Northern Ireland has to remain in the customs territory of the EU. That there are parts of the backstop essentially that you could focus on, and where you seem to be accepting where maybe it's not going to work, maybe you should just try and do that rather than delay it. The other point, I think, where it comes to solving or causing more problems than you solve in the joint exemption area, how difficult do you see it to convince Ireland to have or create an internal border in its own territory? And is that an attractive solution for Ireland to do?
Thank you.
Thank you.
And there's a lady down here as well. I think we'll just take your question as well. Just stay at the end here.
Thank you very much. Gail Souter from the National Farmers Union. My question relates to the earlier question, which hopefully we will be able to take Liam Fox and Michael Gove on their word that we will not in free circulation see goods that don't meet our existing animal welfare and food standards. So I'm a little bit concerned that a lot of the focus to the previous answer was on smuggling of goods, because I think the basis of the question was actually that a free trade agreement is done and that there's free movement of goods around the UK. And so my question is really, we've heard a lot about single epidemiological zone, but what about the other aspects of trade? So if we do a deal with the US or New Zealand or Australia and we cut tariffs, and then you've got the question of rules of origin, how will all that be dealt with? And would the plans for the transitional fund to support businesses also extend to, say, GEB-based businesses who are trading with Northern Ireland in the future?
Yeah. Thank you very much indeed, both excellent questions. I'll bring our technical experts in a moment. All I would say to the gentleman from the Institute for Government, you're right, of course, that in trying to deal with one problem, as we have seen in the course of the last 3 years, more problems are created. I think, as Greg said earlier on, the desirability of having a Northern Ireland Assembly is such that actually it would be better to have one, and then that's an issue, obviously, for them. And there will be other, of course, many completely unrelated challenges that the Assembly will be dealing with. But the point of the report is go back to what we said before, which is about setting out options The government, of course, will decide, the new government next week will decide what they want their negotiating position to be. This is also a set of negotiations. And of course, one of the fundamentals that I think is kind of lost in all this is that Brexit is a process. It's not just about a date. It's not all going to be solved on the 31st of October or not. We are going to be debating, particularly, I think, and perhaps in relation to your question and the free trade agreement. I'm not sure how many parliamentarians have realised quite how long we are going to be debating free trade agreements for years to come in a way that we just haven't had to do for the last 40 years. We're going to be experts in what free trade agreements are going to mean for businesses and others in our relevant constituencies, and it's going to take up a lot of parliamentary time, which we are going to have to create in order for that scrutiny to happen. But I think the difficulty is, what is the alternative? Well, the alternative we know is potentially an accidental no deal, and putting the solutions out there means that the government then has options in relation to sorting out its negotiating position for the next couple of weeks, and we really don't have very long at all. Shanker, do you want to talk, or perhaps others, about this point about either the Northern Ireland Assembly or the joint exemption, but also the other points in relation to potential free trade agreement? I think we do cover rules of origin a bit in the report.
We do, yeah. So in terms of the Northern Ireland Executive and Assembly and this issue of creating an additional problem, I think we have to recognise that this is a dynamic negotiation. This is a dynamic world that we live in, and in the time that between now, or between, let's say, the date that the UK leaves the EU and the time at which the UK may or may not decide, depending on what happens in the future, to diverge from European SPS rules is a period of years. In the very shortest period, I think it would be a period of 2 to 3 years at the minimum. In which case, a lot is going to happen in that period of time. One of the things that's going to happen in that period of time is these negotiations and discussions don't get frozen in time. There will be discussions in the North. There should be discussions in the North-South Ministerial Conference Council, in the British Irish Council, on SPS cooperation, what it means, what the alternatives will be. What does divergence mean for traders in Northern Ireland? What sort of things are you diverging on? I mean, are you diverging on? There are all kinds of SPS rules. There are all kinds of things that we may diverge on in terms of things like hormones or GMO or gene editing versus things that are related to residues or pesticides. Or there's a whole range of things, not all of which we are necessarily going to want to diverge on. So these are conversations that have to happen in those bodies. And all we're saying is that given the fact they haven't happened at all thus far, it is very important for those conversations to be allowed to run for the period of time that they need to run before this decision is actually made. So when the decision is made, it's informed by those things. This is something the UK government will also think about in the context of a trade agreement with some other country that says you must do the following things. We will want, in the UK, we will want to think about what are the implications for this in terms of Northern Ireland. These are many of the factors that we'll be thinking about, which again, the interests of UK farmers, as you rightly raised, will be an issue for that discussion and that debate. And then in terms of your specific questions on rules of origin and some of these other issues, we do cover rules of origin in the report from the perspective of preferential rules of origin. Our position, our approach there is to advocate the use of the registered, the REC system, which we think is a very good facilitation that the Canadians can use now as a result of the CETA agreement. We also, the role of relying on importers' knowledge, which is the standard agreed between the EU and Japan in the Japan agreement, is also a facilitation that will make rule of origin proof a lot easier. So we do have recommendations on how those will be handled. I think that's chapter 12.
Test of knowledge. Well, I'm going to thank you all very much indeed for attending this morning. Thank you very much for the questions. Can I thank again Prosperity UK for pulling all of this together, for keeping us on the straight and narrow as commissioners and as the technical panel. And can I thank the technical panel who are here, but also those who are watching, for all their enormous work that they have done to make this happen in the last 6 weeks. And can I also thank everybody who took part in all of our consultation meetings, who has shared their expertise with us. Sometimes it's been supportive, sometimes there have been great critical questions, but that's the point about this process, is to try to teach